Hey everyone, welcome to week 8 of the Doctrine of Man, of Humanity, and Sin. This week, we have been talking about personal sin, how personal sin both affects us and affects our humanity and what our humanity looks like, and even what that looks like as we sin, participate in sin. But this week we start talking about social cultural sin. So this idea of institutional sin, right? And so what this looks like, in the history of the church, mainly in the Catholic Church, they have differentiated these social sins, like sins that we could deem part of culture, part of institutions, and they're nicely summed up in the sins we omit and the sins we commit. Sins we commit are sins against ourselves, God, and others. Sins that are, these are things we actively do to hurt ourselves, to hurt God, to hurt others. Things that we do, things we commit. This language is very familiar. If you're part of the Catholic Church or Anglican Church, part of the confession on a Sunday morning is talking about how, Lord, forgive us for our sins that we are committing and those sins that we are omitting. The sins of omission are things we don't do that we probably should do. Some of this we can see biblically with the Good Samaritan, right? People pass by the person on the road who needs help, and it's only the Samaritan who stops. And so all these other people, they didn't do anything to the person who was on the side of the road who needed help. But what they did do is they didn't do anything. And so it's a sin of omission. It's a sin of not doing something. And so we can see that sin often in our own lives and within culture, within institutions, within society. One of the greatest sins of omission, both commission, things we do, and omission, things that we don't do, is racism, especially racism in the United States. Now, often, depending on where you go, we see a lot of the sins of people committing the sins of racism, injustice within the United States. But oftentimes it's a sin of omission, especially for the middle-class white American, which is just ignoring the problem, or not seeing the problem, or not doing anything actively for those that are being oppressed, or for those being discriminated, kind of looking the other way. So that would be an example of sins of omission. Sometimes we see this within maybe our jobs or within our lives. Maybe we just in our daily lives, it's saying that, well, there might be something going on, but I just ignore it, right? I don't want to see it. It's not my responsibility. It's someone else's job to deal with it, to do something about it. It's not mine. So that would be an example of sins of omission. So these two distinctions. It's actually a good way of understanding different social sins, both commission and omission, as they relate to how we participate in these cultural social sins, and also personal, right? We can apply those two terms personally of how I respond to my own active sinning, but it also envelops this idea of my participation in the system. What we see is that these committed and omitted sins within both my personal, but within an organization, over time they build up, right? Say if I started an organization and my own sins of committing or omitting creates a structure of this organization, and then other people come in to this structure, what happens is that perspective of that worldview that I established the foundation of this organization then contributes to this systemic kind of sin or injustice over time, based on whatever it was when it was created. And so other people might come into that and they participate both in the sins of omission, sins of commission, in that injustice system, whether or not they are actively doing it or passively doing it. They participate in the unhealthiness of the system, the evil per se of the system, based on the sin of the foundation or the creation of it, maybe the intention or byproduct of the organization or institution. What we see is that individuals within the corporate system then will their own sins they'll justify them because of the system, because of the corporate structure. What we see is that we are a product then of the community, really. And so if a corporation is doing something unethical, evil, not helpful to the community, what we will see is people, even if they disagree with the organization, a lot of times it's because of their job, they will follow orders. They'll actually participate in part of the unhealthy, sinful nature of the system or the organization, and then they will validate or give reasons for their own participation in it. What we see is actually within corporate organizations, this happens often, where people would say, well, why were you doing this thing that you obviously don't agree with? And either they say, well, it's because I was told to do it, or everyone else was doing it, or they start justifying the sin itself. Well, it really wasn't that bad. Well, it really didn't hurt anybody. And so they start justifying it to validate their participation in the sinful system. This is why individuals within, say, Nazi Germany, people that responded to orders within the Holocaust, did it and was doing the wrong, but didn't feel connected to the evil or the wrong. They blamed, well, if someone else had made the decision, I'm just following orders. If I don't do it, someone else will. Whatever that is, right? There's validation within that system, so they don't see themselves as fault participating in such an evil organization. It's always someone else's blame. So this is what happens within unhealthy systems and sin within a social cultural context. There was also a social experiment with psychologists up in Stanford called the Stanford Prison Experiment. And what they did here is he did this experiment where he took students, right? They were equal on the same plane, all equal students, and separated them between prisoner and guard. Now, the guards were instructed to act like a prison, and the prisoners to experience it as a prison. And so they made it as realistic as possible. Now, the goal of the experiment was to see how that system then influenced and affected those involved. What we see is actually over time that the system got even more unhealthy. Those guards did things that they probably would not normally do to their fellow student. And the reason they did it is because it was told to them to play this role. And so for the success of the experiment, they played a role. And they did the best they could. And so therefore, encouraging the sinful, harmful nature of the system, even if each individual would say, well, would you do that again to your fellow student outside of this experiment, this system? And they would say no. So it was only within the system that they play that role. And sometimes people would say, well, I didn't even recognize myself. Like I got lost in the role, or I got lost in the environment. I didn't even know what I was doing, right? Stuff like that. And so what happens is that they validate their that sin somehow being played out into the system, even if they were actively doing it, or sins of omission, right, where they weren't standing up for their fellow students who were obviously being abused as prisoners within this experiment. So the conclusion really is that within a system, people will do what they're told to do, even if they wouldn't do it on their own. There's a social sin-evil dynamic that we participate in, and many times try to distance ourselves psychologically so that we can cope with the fact that we are part of the system. The bottom line is there are evil systemic systems, sinful within culture and society, that we participate in all the time, not even knowing the extent of those systems. And sometimes we just pretend not to know. Especially in the United States, our tendency is that sin of omission, right? We don't want to know. I don't want to know where my battery for my Apple products comes from, even if it's slavery of kids in Africa to get cobalt. I don't want to know those things, right? I enjoy the product, and so I pretend not to see it, right? That would be a sin of omission instead of actively pushing against the system. So these are things we participate in all the time, and there are often underlying sinful, whether it's injustice, actively injustice, or sins of omission. There's something about system that is unhealthy and perpetuates sin within culture. Tim Keller, in his talk, talks about the different responses to systemic sins in our culture. He says there are ways to participate sinfully within the sinful system, and he labels those different ways, whether actively participating or deflecting or just ignoring it altogether. He goes on to define systemic evil as a system that marginalizes people or groups on the basis of race, even though most people in the system are not intentionally trying to do it. And oftentimes within a social cultural sin, a system, most people aren't intentionally trying to be bad people, to be sinful people, to do harm to other people. Right, when I buy my Apple product, I'm not intentionally trying to enslave kids in Africa, or whatever it is. Many of the things, of the products we have in the U.S., gotten through unhealthy, sinful means. But I don't actively buy those products knowing those things. It's more of this passive participation. However, that participation not only extends the systemic evil towards a race, towards a people, towards a group, but I'm participating and am culpable, guilty in some sense, of participating in that system. Well, this led to South American Latino theologians who had experienced oppression and injustice of generations to talk about sin as mainly a system, a cultural system. Not necessarily what individuals do, but what systems do to individuals. This developed what is called liberation theology, because sin is a very social, systemic issue. Then salvation, then for the liberation theologian, salvation is then freedom from those oppressive structures, governments, systems. One of those theologians, Gustavo Gutierrez, in his book, A Theology of Liberation, there it is, I think it's in your syllabus, he talks about this. He says, in the liberation approach, sin is not considered as an individual, private, or merely interior reality, asserted just enough to necessitate spiritual redemption, which does not challenge the order which we live. Sin is regarded as social, historical fact, absence of fellowship and love in relationship among persons, the breach of friendship with God and others, and therefore an interior personal fracture. So here we see sin is evident in the oppressive structures. It's within our systems. It's the exploitation of humans by humans. He goes on to say, sin is the evident in the oppressive structures, exploitation of humans by humans, and the domination and slavery of peoples, races, social classes. Sin appears, therefore, as a fundamental alienation, the root of a situation of injustice and exploitation. So we see that the root of all of that is sin, really. Now, it doesn't have to be racial injustice. It doesn't, but at the root of all unjust systems, things that exploit people, things that oppress people, is sin, some kind of sin. Now, that could have been an individual sin that started it, but that's a social, corporate sin, as he argues, that then influences the internal response to it, of internal sinful response to it. And so the structures then help, lead people towards their individual personal sin, even if they don't participate within that system, their experience of it, and even their participation in it. So it develops this sinful, internal sinful response. We see biblically that the response to social sin is called the idea of justice, right? The idea of justice is a response to our experience of social systemic sins. For liberation theology, the result of God's kingdom work in the world is a changed societal structure that point to God and justice and are redeemed of their evil influences and roots, their foundation that created this unjust system that perpetuates injustice and evil and sin within the world. An article by Biola University here in Southern California says this about systemic injustice. It is any system that either requires or encourages those within the system to break the moral laws of God revealed for his creatures flourishing, right? So there's an intended moral law of God for people to flourish. Part of that is freedom, healing, relationship. Again, with Gutierrez, what he talks about is this, at the heart of sin is social broken relationship, both with God and other people. We can see that as we talk about the Trinity, the communion with God, the intention of salvation and growth, that we participate with this relational God with us and with other people in fellowship. Well, the breaking of that does a lot of harmful things. We look at the original fall story. That breaking creates that existential loneliness. It makes us feel like we have to do everything alone. It makes us feel like we need to protect ourselves, be vengeful, and do everything we need to do to survive. And so, really, any system that points the people in the system against the very moral laws of God would be this systemic injustice or evil system. Now, again, we can be participants in the system or recipients, right? Maybe we experience the byproduct of this sinful system, that we have pain and hurt and all of these other things because of the system. Or maybe we participate in it in sins of omission and we just kind of ignore the bad that is happening because of the system. Basically, from these examples, we can see that sin is much more than just an individual participation, right? It is my sin and my individual sin, but there is this idea of a corporate sin and unjust, corrupt systems within the world that perpetuate injustice, that perpetuate my own sin, my participation in it, in unjust systems within the world that oppress people. And so as we talk about sin, we have to take into account that these systems are influential in both our responses, our formation, our worldview, how we see the world, how we participate in the world, and actively how we seek God's redemption both in our own lives and in the world. Now, that's not to say that every system in the world exhibits systemic injustice. Many of them do. But rather, it is to say that most, if not all systems, even well-intentioned, without being rooted in the kingdom of God worldview, like pointing to God, will tend towards this influence of sin, right? We talked about our capacities being limited. They point back to ourselves. Well, if I created a system, whatever that system's intention was, it's going to point back to the self or something other than God. Well, that sinful foundation will lead to other things. Whether or not we are aware of those dynamics within the social injustice system or not. And some of us who profit, right, off of the system are more inclined to ignore the sins of the injustice or the sins of the system because we are okay with it. We can see that in the video from the Bible Project, where those that are the oppressors, those that benefit from the system, are less likely to change the system. And one of the notes that they make, which is very fascinating, that those that get freed from the system actually respond in the same way, in vengeance and in revenge that they had experienced from the system. It's almost like that was what was modeled for them, and so they repeat it. And it's very interesting how the sin within the system then replicates itself in the individual. The sin, my participation internally in that sin, and then in the system externally in whatever that system might be doing that is sinful. So it's to say that all of those systems, the foundation, it points to something other than God. Now, it doesn't take a lot of observation to see there are a lot of governments, a lot of institutions, a lot of organizations around the world are founded on principles of profit inequality and something that we could say sinful, meaning away from God, right, to something else. Could be money, fame, to something else other than God. And those influences then will form us, right, because everything forms us. We're constantly being formed, right? And so it will affect us in many ways, in sinful ways, right? We will participate in sin. We'll say yes to things that we normally wouldn't say yes to, right? If I said, would you oppress kids in Africa? You'd say no. I was like, do you want this Apple product? You'd say yes, right? It's like, okay, do you realize what you're doing and seeing the extent of that? And so how do we then participate differently, change systems, and what is our invitation to changing those? Organizations changing the way things are done and how they're influencing people, not only influencing people within the organization, but the effects that are on those people that it is oppressing. And that's the question that, as we are aware of sin, and the sin within the systems, how do we change it? How do we grow? And what does that look like? So watch all the videos. They're very insightful. And then next week, our final week, we'll talk about kind of now the result of sin. The now what? What does this mean for us individually, socially, culturally? What does this mean for our relationship with God? What does this mean moving forward? How do we put all this together? As we've talked about us being sinful, as missing the perfect mark of God, missing the ideal of being made in the image of God in humanity, and what does that look like as we kind of move forward. So until next week.